everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Mary, co-founder of Lindus Health. So this webinar is about achieving rapid regulatory approval, specifically for digital therapeutics or digital health products. This is things like an FDA 510K or a CE mark. And this is a huge milestone for any health company, particularly your first regulatory approval. But we know that the clinical trials needed to secure this approval are often the costliest and the longest step of the whole process. And it can feel super complicated. Companies don't even know where to start often, especially because most of the advice and regulatory pathways are geared towards traditional drug products. So we're hosting this webinar and others in the series with the aim of demystifying this process, specifically for digital health and digital therapeutics companies. And we're really excited to be able to hear from experts like Jason and pioneers in the digital health space like Athena, Acacia, and our host Paul to tell us more about this process. So we'll shortly hand over to Paul and to our expert panel. But first, a quick obligatory plug for our company, Lindus Health. So our mission at Lindus Health is to accelerate clinical trials for biotech and health tech startups so patients can benefit from new treatments sooner. We do this by conducting entire clinical trials end-to-end, replacing the need to work with a traditional CRO. We use our software platform and EHR data to help customers design better clinical trials, recruit participants, and run a trial efficiently, from electronic data capture to monitoring and project management. Our products have been used to recruit, onboard, and handle data from thousands of patients, and we've helped run over 60 trials and studies to date, up to 3 times faster than traditional CROs. So imagine if we could help you achieve your first FDA 510K or CE mark a year ahead of schedule. And we also work with experts in regulatory affairs on how to design a study to help you achieve rapid regulatory approval. So contact us. My email is just there to learn more about our platform, to see how we could help run your next trial faster, or you can reach out to us via our website. Cool, so that's all for now. Thank you once again for joining. Thank you very much to our panel, and I'll hand over to Paul now to kick us off.
Thanks, Mary. That's great. Thank you for hosting and for your introduction. So my name is Paul Wicks. I'm a neuropsychologist by training, and I'm an independent consultant in digital health. It's a real pleasure to welcome everybody here today. As Mary said, this conversation is going to be recorded, so if there are other people you might want to share this with later on, you'll have that opportunity. You'll also be able to ask us some Q&A. There is a Q&A button down below, which will allow us to answer some questions later on in the discussion. And of course, if you have any technical issues, there's a chat button, and if you use that, there are some members of staff at the Lindus team that can help with anything that bubbles up. So I'll go into introductions in a second, just to say a little bit about my selfish motivations, other than getting to hang out with very interesting people and learn more about them. But I've been working in digital health for about 20 years now, originally in sort of online communities, so places like Patients Like Me, bulletin boards, email listservs, maybe even Usenet, if people remember that. And one of the challenges I always found in the space was you could do all sorts of really interesting things, and you could see the strength of those communities coming together, but there weren't really mechanisms to systematically get the benefit of improving outcomes that those communities could have. And so, our experience at somewhere like Patients Like Me was you could have this great community where people are helping each other. There wasn't actually a model to regulate that and say, is this safe? Is this valid? And there was certainly no reimbursement methods to say, actually, well, gosh, if you're improving people's quality of life or their depression, there should be reimbursement for that. And so what we saw maybe 5-10 years ago were lots of business models that were trying to utilize some of the aspects of the internet, but didn't really have much alignment between what communities really needed and the sort of concerns that clinicians had, the sort of concerns that payers had. So I think the whole digital therapeutic space is a really interesting experiment in some ways that's only been around for 5 or 6 years to try and reconcile some of these things. But of course, it's buffering up against 100, 200 years of institutions that have been around: scientific delivery of medicines, clinical care, psychiatry, all these other types of areas. And the way in which we integrate those will really decide whether or not in 5 to 10 years we'll have seen this whole adventure as a success or not. So I'm really pleased to say we've got some fantastic experts here, and I'm going to let them each introduce themselves. So if we go around and if you introduce yourself, maybe give us a few minutes background on kind of how you got into the space you're in, the role that you're in, and then anything in particular that you've seen as the greatest surprise, the learning experience of coming into digital therapeutics, or the greatest humbling experience would be great to hear from. So Acacia, can we start with you, please?
Oh, I see. Yes,
alphabetical-ish.
Sure. Hi, my name is Acacia Parks. I am a research psychologist by training. I began as a professor and then as a research executive at Happify Health, now Twill, with a real focus on kind of setting research agenda. We started off as a consumer company and really just about like getting research-based tools in the hands of consumers. But that mission evolved into the more clinical space and trying to think about potentially both prescription and non-prescription digital therapeutics during my time there. I really started in my career, I think like everybody here, I'm really interested in population health, right? Impacting health at scale. And I was particularly interested in mental health and preventing depression, just understanding there's all of this literature that finds that if you teach people the things that they need to tackle depression before they become depressed, they can actually use those skills and never get depressed in the first place. And that's even possible just blew my mind. And like, why weren't we just telling everybody this? Why were we not teaching everybody these things? So I got into industry to do that, and understanding that academia was not kind of a frustrating place to try and have major impact at scale. So when I was at Happify Twill, I would say part of what was really exciting for me was the opportunity to develop a prescription digital therapeutic called Ensemble, which we released during the pandemic to target generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. To me, this was just a huge thing, a huge victory in terms of being able to translate science into something that people could really access. Of course, it took a lot to get there. And I would say that the wake-up call or the humbling thing to me is just how stark the wall is. And like now that I'm working back in a space that touches wellness, right? Happify kind of moved towards this, Twill had moved towards this more digital therapeutic, very, very clinical, that the wellness space is still very much the wild, wild west, right? Compared to the types of regulations that we deal with on, when we're trying to create an FDA cleared product. So I thought it was really interesting to me that, I started in the wellness space. I moved into the more regulated space, and now I'm in a place where we prescribe FDA regulated medications, make treatment claims, but also have a digital product that's wellness, and I manage coaches who are completely not, they're very much in the wellness space, that there's no in between, right? There's super regulated and there's wellness, and that's very interesting to me just from a consumer well-being. I have mixed feelings, right, about like ease of innovation, but also consumer protections.
Great. Yeah, and it's always amazing the disconnect. I mean, once you're steeped in this regulatory space, just to walk through a pharmacy store, once you actually know how regulated, how tested, how safe, and how validated each of the different things are, you start to worry that like, here is the Isle of Death and uncertainty. But the app store is not necessarily any better. So, Athena, over to you.
Thanks, Paul and Acacia. Great to see you and hear about you. And I want to just say ditto, but I'll go ahead and introduce myself as well. Want to take the easy road out. But yeah, so I'm Athena Robinson. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I am currently Chief Clinical Officer at Woebot Health. And so there I oversee our program of research and our regulatory strategy. And similar to Acacia, our company has a suite of emotional support products. So my experience is in developing research pipelines for prescription digital therapeutics for SAMD, specifically for clinical indications where there are claims, where there's IFU considerations, we're designing the regulatory trial, we're interfacing with FDA, and then also with the NPDT products in the wild, wild west that kind of Acacia referred to, and understanding the difference therein, and being a company, not a lot of companies have both. And so being a company that kind of has both and really thinking through the nuance therein. Prior to joining Woebot, I was a professor at Stanford Department of Psychiatry for about a dozen or so years, where I'm still adjunct now, but I sort of did more traditional academic work there. I was really steeped in NIH and other funded grant ways of studying psychotherapeutic interventions for a wide variety of clinical indications, and was really doing implementation science of mobile, leveraged, and other modalities for implementing those evidence-supported treatments for different clinical indications, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and partnering with sites nationally to do that. I'm still a practicing clinical psychologist. So from the ground up, I am patient-centric and really patient-focused, and like Acacia, really decided to make the move to industry from academia towards making products that not are only evidence-based, but get to people in need faster. I think some of the things that have been humbling for me are being in the space, which is relatively nascent compared to things like pharmacotherapy and general medical device, and watching ourselves learn, watching myself learn, watching other companies learn, watching the FDA learn alongside of us. It's a very dynamic process. Things are shifting as we speak. Guidance documents are getting published as we speak. And then in addition, COVID hit. So watching all these factors intersect for me has been really quite humbling, and learning where we fall as SAMD for psychiatric devices within the spectrum of traditional pharmacotherapy style approaches and traditional device approaches. So that's me.
That's great, Athena. Thank you. Yeah, no, COVID just transformed everything, and clearly it's had a devastating impact, and must acknowledge the millions of lives lost and a great impact it's had. I was so surprised and puzzled how from like 2010 to 2020, so many aspects of our lives had technology involved, right? You could summon your Tesla out of your garage with your smartphone, and yet in mental health, in provision of care, we were still using bits of paper, we were still showing up to doctor's offices. So it took something like that to really make a change. But like, it feels like now when we all describe what we do, we maybe don't have to have the preamble as much to people that like, hey, there are these things that you can't talk to your doctor. So great. Jason, you are not a psychologist.
I am not.
Tell us about you.
I'm not. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I think that's beyond me. Pleasure to be here with the panel today. So I started my career as I've been in the medical device industry for 20 years almost. I started my career as an engineer and a scientist, designing, developing algorithms for pacemakers, defibrillators, and neurostim devices for a large medical device company. And then I became an attorney focused on the medical device industry. My passion is medical devices. I tell folks that I don't do drugs personally or professionally. That's my motto. But interestingly, as we get into digital therapeutics and digital health technologies, there's certainly a convergence of different types of technologies, whether it's traditional medical devices or consumer or wellness type products, and even pharmaceutical products at this point. So it's an interesting area. I'm starting to have to kind of retract my standard motto there a little bit. But so for the last, I guess, 12 years or more, I have been working with companies, large and small, foreign and domestic, really across the clinical spectrum, to help them understand the legal regulatory landscape for digital health, digital therapeutic technologies, pre and post market. So really kind of understand what it takes to get through the FDA, not just from a regulatory perspective, but also from a broader regulatory compliance perspective. For example, one of the things that oftentimes I come to the realization, and clients come to the realization as we're talking about, they're preparing a 510K or de novo submission, come to the realization that there's a part of the regulatory requirements that you actually build your product under a quality system. And many companies, particularly in software only companies, can very easily develop a product and feel as though they're ready to go to the FDA, and then come to grips with reality that they didn't build the product under the quality system, and much of their testing and needs to be redone, and documentation generated consistent with what the FDA's requirements are. And so so that's always a tough conversation to have with clients. But For me, I think when it comes to something that's kind of surprising or humbling in this space is really around kind of misunderstanding of the regulatory requirements. Almost, it kind of alluded to that in regards to quality system requirements, but not just in the industry. There's misunderstanding in the industry, and certainly across different segments of the industry, there's different perspectives and understanding of what the expectations are. But also within the FDA, I mean, there's quite a bit of inconsistency within the agency as to what the expectations are. Often, Athena referenced guidance documents that are developed. Those guidance documents are developed by policy folks within the agency, and they work with the scientists and the reviewers to a certain extent. But the policy is what the kind of the goal is. That's the target. And then when you get into the weeds with the reviewers and the scientists and the clinicians at the agency, that isn't necessarily, it doesn't always hit target. And so there's quite a bit of misunderstanding within the agency. And then, like I said, in the different segments of industry that are involved in this space, pharma has a very different perspective on DTX than medical device, traditional medical device companies, just because the starting point for each of those segments is different. So that always kind of surprises me a bit, because I just, live and breathe in the medical device space, which is really the area that DTX falls. So yeah, I guess that's about me.
That's great. Thanks, Jason. And actually, bearing in mind, we've had a little bit of a look at some of the audience members that are here. I think there's a spread. Some people are very experienced in this area. Some people might be newer. So I thought it might be useful is if we go back a step and maybe talk about 510K versus de novo submissions. I have the advantage. I don't really know a lot about the differences between those. So can you give us kind of a high level overview, and then maybe Athena or Acacia, if you can come in if you've had some experience of going down these pathways, or any of the kind of like 2-step forward, 1-step back type experiences you've had, that would be great as well. But yeah, so Jason, can you give us the sort of tweet length? What is the difference? Is there always a right way to go, or does it depend? How would we know that we were in this path versus that path more appropriately?
Yeah, so there's generally three ways to get through the FDA, and the least burdensome is the 510K process. In the 510K process, you have to demonstrate that your product is what's called substantially equivalent to a legally marketed medical device. And by legally marketed, it means that the FDA has authorized that product to be in the market. It's not just because you can buy it on Amazon or Apple does it mean that it's legally marketed. So in order to demonstrate substantial equivalence, there's two things that you have to demonstrate. You have to demonstrate that you have the same intended use as the predicate device, and you have the same or similar technology. So the first strategy should always be to see if you can pursue a 510K, because it is the least burdensome path. It is faster, it's cheaper, it's a fairly predictable path through the FDA. But if there isn't a predicate, which oftentimes in the DTX space there isn't, because these are very innovative technologies and there isn't something on the market already, by default you end up in the PMA process, which is the most burdensome process, which is typically for like implantable devices, things of that nature, higher risk products. And so and that's a really burdensome process. So the FDA established 20 some years ago a de novo process, which essentially is saying that the product, because it doesn't have a predicate, can't go through the 510K process, it technically would have to fall through in the PMA process, but the risk profile of the product is lower and doesn't really warrant the rigorous oversight of the PMA process. And so the de novo process is a way for the manufacturer, the developer of the product, to petition the FDA to reduce the regulatory risk oversight, and to define that product as a lower classification, a less risky product. That de novo process is expensive and time consuming to prepare. But the advantage of being in the de novo process is that you get to set the bar. So when it comes to clinical evidence, when it comes to acceptance criteria as it relates to your performance, You as the de novo applicant, you get to set the bar, which you could either set really high, which makes it hard for competitors to meet that in the future, or in some instances you may be able to get the bar lower so that you can get into the market quicker, because your product is so innovative and maybe there's no alternatives for the clinical application that you're focused on. And so you get to kind of set the rules. Of course, you have to get buy-in from the FDA, but you get to kind of lay the groundwork for that. And then, of course, if you're going through the de novo process, the presumption is your product is more innovative than what's in the market today, which allows for a market advantage and gives you some opportunity to kind of market your product. Maybe if you're an early stage company, generate some interest from VCs and customers, et cetera.
Yeah, I would add to that too, that the burdensomeness of the de novo is not just on the company, but also on FDA. So like, I've definitely had some conversations where the FDA may have its own point of view about whether something is different enough, and where there might be gray area. You might look at something as a potential predicate. And like, we had conversations about this all the time. Like, could this be a predicate for us? And there were places where something could have served as a predicate or was talked about as a potential predicate that's pretty far from where like I, as somebody relatively naive, would look and say, oh yeah, that's similar enough. I'm like, wow, that's pretty different, but like there's this one parallel and that's enough. And the reason I highlight that is because there is this ambiguous area where something is not necessarily de novo or 510K, where a company may want to be in de novo and FDA may say, is that worth the additional burden on the agency? So I think the idea that FDA also has their own opinions on this, I found that very interesting.
Yeah, and I would add to the considerations for them. I totally agree with Jason and Acacia, and I would layer cake right onto that, the industry or the company's preference for how it's going to be used in the market, and sort of how those early market research considerations and the build of your product, the utilization of your product, how you're talking with SMEs and KOLs, subject matter experts, and key opinion leaders about how they'll utilize your product in the market can help influence as well a preferred pathway from the industry, from the company's perspective, even though to Acacia's point, FDA will have an opinion as well. But that really brings not just your regulatory team to the table, but also your commercial team to the table as the company itself makes the decisions and moves forward.
Yeah, one other thing to add there in the context of clinical evidence is, historically, and many people perceive that 510K pathway does not require clinical evidence. And for many medical devices, that's true, in the sense that you don't have to run a prospective clinical trial necessarily to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of products that typically, many of which go through the 510K process. That has changed significantly. So even if you are pursuing a 510K pathway, the FDA is increasingly looking for prospective data to demonstrate, if not in a prospective clinical trial, real world evidence of some sort that supports the safety and effectiveness of the product, even if you're pursuing a 510K. If you're in the de novo world, you almost certainly will need to run a prospective clinical trial to support the submission. But many people kind of equate 510K with no clinical trial, and that's kind of a more historical view of the situation.
I would agree with that. I think it's a different situation in the sense that digital therapeutics are something FDA is still gaining comfort with, and with each device they approve, they become more comfortable in certain ways. But maybe 10 years from now, it won't so much be the case. In this case, we're still proving digital therapeutics work at all, even if there was a similar device. The more different what you're doing is from exactly what somebody else did. But I'll tell you now, and I can't be specific, there are ways that we discussed with FDA of doing something very similar to something already approved, and they still want to see new data. And I think it comes back to that comfort level of just wanting to see it right in front of them.
And I think, Acacia, I don't know what your thoughts are, but safety is such a fundamental element of that. The FDA's like traditional, understandable commitment to safety evaluation, that even if you come with data already collected, they may be interested in having safety evaluated in a particular way with a particular measure at a particular cadence at particular assessment points. So it's really helpful to have those sort of discussions with them as you're planning a prospective trial to make sure that you're aligned.
Well, those are all signs they're looking for comfort, right? Like they have a certain PRO, they have a certain way of measuring things that they're comfortable with. And if you can match that and make them feel comfortable, that's always helpful, right? So yeah, you sort of see this sign of like, but could I see this exact thing that I saw before? Which to me just sort of signals newness and the need for more data because of that.
Are you typically seeing that there's a lot of carryover from the world of drugs, like the same types of PROs, the same type of outcome measures that people would see in drug trials? And what's expected? Because I guess I'm very conscious that so many of those instruments were designed a long time ago, were designed for paper to be administered, in a waiting room. And then when we shrink them down to teeny tiny little screens, they seem quite burdensome instruments. So sometimes they seem a little out of touch, a little out of date. There's a lot of stuff that like, oh, can you go to the grocery store and get your shopping? Whereas we know if people have got challenges, they can get them delivered, right? So there's a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't necessarily make sense, but because they're the validated and the well-known thing, we end up kind of
deeply, yes. I mean, and I can't be too specific, but I can think of specific cases where something that would be feasible on a pharma budget, but that would be very, very difficult for somebody to support on a digital therapeutics budget, just because it's what's been done before. And it's what's comfortable. And so it's the best apples to apples way to just say, look, you're comfortable with this. Let me show you on the same measure, but then matching that can be really challenging. And that isn't to say, right, that you couldn't have a conversation about something else, but in general, being able to go with what's recognizable where you can is to your advantage. So that's definitely a tension. Athena, I'm sure you've had similar conversations.
Totally agree. I think the measures piece is one of those humbling elements, and they're different from kind of traditional academia, what's of interest to the FDA, what's of interest to payers or reimbursers as well. There are some measures that are of interest to the FDA that, whilst I've been in, psychotherapeutic research for 20 years, we don't use in the clinic because they're not really practically implementable. And they are expensive, in other words, to implement.
Or reliable.
Or in your everyday clinic setting. So I understand the FDA is familiar with them, and they have deep and rich histories with them in perhaps pharmacotherapy trials, et cetera. But in traditional, where we're coming from, psychotherapeutic research, they may be a little less familiar. And so it's been really interesting to carry forward some of these measures to ensure adequate clinical outcome, adequate safety, but then bear the burden of translating that to your audiences of interest, whether that's like you're putting it out into a publication into the world for a scientific community to digest, whether you're talking to the FDA or whether you're talking to a potential payer or reimburser or provider in some sort of healthcare ecosystem, or they're like, can you tell me what that measure is again? I'm not sure. We don't typically use that. So that's been something that we've had to kind of straddle and be mindful of as well.
Yeah, and to be clear, the FDA doesn't, in most cases, doesn't really have the authority to dictate a particular approach or a particular benchmark, reference standard, what have you. They certainly, to Acacia and Athena's point, have their preferences and their comfort zones. But the reality is you as the manufacturer get to define what is appropriate for your product, for your clinical application, and your intended use. And so certainly there are situations where you might argue with the agency regarding a kind of a standard that you might be benchmarking against. And the key is to have a really good justification for it, right? Because if you can demonstrate that, and the clinicians on the review team are going to come with their biases, and if you can argue and justify your clinical reasoning for the approach that you're taking, you can win the day. I mean, that's where lawyers like myself, who work with smart people like Acacia and Athena, to make those arguments and try to move the FDA in a direction that's more amenable to your approach.
Well, and the other thing too, and I mean, feel free to let me know if I got this. This is really me reading in between the lines, but my sense is that, you know, whether something gets approved or not is like deciding whether a person passes a test or not, where like there's a lot of room over here between, you know, 80% and 100% where you're still passing the test. And so there may be certain things that make you, but overall they have to decide whether to pass the whole thing. It's not like your dissertation where they mark one piece and be like, actually, I want you to redo this. They could, right, give you feedback and reject, but in the end, they have to decide whether to accept or reject. So I think what Jason's kind of referring to is that you have to gauge the level of risk you're willing to take, because in the end, they have to decide whether it makes them uncomfortable enough that it's a deal breaker, or whether it's just this one thing in a context of an otherwise unobjectionable submission that they may choose to pass it through.
Yeah, and so just to be clear, anything I say is not meant to be legal advice, but the standard here, the legal standard, whether you're talking about a 510K de novo, is a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, right? That's what the FDA has to decide. Have you presented enough data to give them a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness? Now, the standard below that, when you dig into that and what that means in the 510K context, is the substantial equivalence analysis that I mentioned. What I didn't mention on the de novo side, the analysis to determine whether you have presented data to support the conclusion of reasonable assurance of safety effectiveness is the benefit outweighs the risk. So in the de novo process, you have to present the benefits of your product, and they can't just be theoretical. They have to actually be, there has to be data to show that there are benefits to this. That's the performance or the effectiveness data that you would be presenting. And then the risks you have to present and say, okay, here are the potential risks. And there are a number of ones that are pretty common in this space for DTX. And then you have to show data related to those risks, and ultimately evaluate, from a clinical perspective, does the benefit outweigh the risk? And again, to Acacia's point, there's a lot of subjectivity in that, right? And if you can be persuasive in the way that you communicate with the agency, and provide them enough data that they can conclude that there is a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, then you can get your product through either the 510K or the de novo process.
Do we have to have the same ratio of safety and effectiveness for DTX as we do for other products? I mean, we look at, and people argue about the meta-analyses of things like SSRIs, the relatively modest benefits they have for the side effects they can have of, withdrawal issues, serotonin shock syndrome, interaction with other medications, all these sorts of things. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the risk profile of DTX seems to, so far, be incredibly low. So sometimes it feels like those two things are sort of hanging in the balance, and maybe we're familiar with those from pharmaceuticals. And I guess in your previous life with the implantables, if you've got batteries and wires in a surgery, again, there's a risk there. But it seems to me, at least, like with some exceptions and some vulnerable populations, the risks of DTX seem quite low, especially in the context of, the harm of TikTok to young people and self-image or something like that, right? Like we have to look at the overall environment, especially the digital environment in which many users will be operating day to day, and kind of going, wow, we're being super stringent about this. And yet there's all this unregulated, potentially quite harmful depressogenic activity kind of going on. So are we being overly conservative, do you think, as a society, and looking at these technologies in this way?
It so depends on the disease indication, right? Like,
yeah, I can't speak to the society, but certainly to Acacia's point, it's absolutely related to the disease indication, the technology, because if you are in a space where there aren't any alternatives, the expectations for the benefit risk analysis is much lower than if you've got 5 other products that are competitive, whether it's pharmaceutical or medical device or combination thereof, then the expectations are going to be higher. The FDA is going to say, well, we're not going to let you get away with a lower benefit or performance because there's all these other products that are doing better than you are. So it definitely depends on where you are in the landscape of things. Sorry to interrupt, Acacia.
we were tag teaming.
One thing I would add to that, though, is when I look at trends in regards to DTX specifically, like on the risk side, there are some trends that you see consistently the FDA is focused on, which are related to kind of the impact of the product on treatment, meaning does use of the product alone worsen your treatment, worsen your condition, excuse me, meaning like if you're using a gamified type DTX product, are you causing more harm than good because you're using a game scenario versus taking a pill or something, or using some other embodiment of the technology? Another and most common risk that the FDA identifies is ultimately are you creating some type of ineffective device, in the sense that the treatment that you're supposedly or purportedly providing actually doesn't do anything, and then ultimately the concern being that you might actually real treatment may be delayed, and then the patient may be harmed in some way. And then there are I've seen some very device or specific or scenario specific risks that the FDA has identified related to kind of the method or the technology that's used. So if you're talking about virtual reality type technologies that are in DTX, the FDA is concerned that by using the virtual reality, the headset alone may cause nausea or discomfort, or cause somebody to fall or something of that nature. So there's kind of secondary risks that aren't necessarily associated with the core treatment, on a physiological level necessarily, but maybe the approach that you take to implementing the treatment may end up having risks that you have to be taking into consideration in your clinical trials, in your benefit risk analysis.
Yeah, I think you're raising a really good point about the SAMD's ideal utilization and implementation structure. And it kind of relates to what Acacia was talking about before with comfortability, and the use of it concurrent with standard of care, the use of it instead of standard of care, the use of it prior to standard of care, depending upon the clinical indication. What is the standard of care? Is it an ideology, or people actually getting that standard of care? How do you talk about that with FDA? So I think adjunctive use to standard of care, or prior to it or instead of it, is another consideration when you're talking about pathways and relative risk to benefit ratios, as well as the overall safety profile of what your device and how you're conversing about it with FDA.
Yeah, and certainly there's a risk of opportunity cost, right? So there was just a report, and again, people might not agree with it, that mindfulness in classrooms in the UK didn't appear to have a major benefit or any benefit that was clinically discernible. And you could say, well, those are resources that could have been put towards, counselors in schools dealing with more high acuity usage, rather than, trying to, get everybody to do this. So certainly the opportunity cost is there. And also we're seeing as these products starting to do things like interact with more traditional medical devices, starting to interact with, well, you should take this medication at this frequency, right? So definitely, I think we all probably want to go beyond just it's a simple back and forth in a screen, and having maybe these quality management systems and taking this view from the get-go of safety versus efficacy is definitely a way to go. I want to come back to something you said, Athena, maybe about different study designs or different requirements. So occasionally I will read a study from academia about a project that it spun up for a grant and then it sort of spun down again because the grant ran out. Or occasionally you'll see a paper in JMIR or something from a startup that kind of did a couple of studies but then kind of ran out of funding. And so that then begs the obvious question, well, are people looking for different things, right? So very often the customers that we're looking for, if they're not a direct-to-consumer kind of monthly subscription type thing, are employers, are payers, maybe physicians have to write a prescription and goes into the big US health system. What are the different types of evidence approaches that we have to take? Is there some holy grail of a unified evidence approach, or sort of how do we get there? Because these things are expensive, right?
They're really expensive. And I'd love to hear the other panelists' thoughts on this. But to speak broadly, and, when you think about efficacy, iterative efficacy generation in a traditional academic sense, or when you're bringing a new, for example, psychotherapeutic intervention to the field, you would step by step demonstrate that efficacy in a very a priori laid out thoughtful fashion. So maybe you do a first pilot study, single arm open label study to try to understand, is there merit to this? And then you might go against a waitlist control, then you might go treatment as usual, or and then eventually you're comparing to the standard of care or the gold standard. And it's kind of this traditional arc of how you demonstrate efficacy and then how you put that out into the world. And then maybe post that you do an implementation or dissemination study. When it comes to the FDA, it's a little bit different. You want to understand, depending upon your pathway, what the nature of the control condition is, and what the nature of the claim you want to make is, what the nature of the IFU is. It's not necessarily a one-to-one ratio of the demonstration of the same thing. And then so towards that, your outcomes might be different. The safety aim that you include might be different and more robust, more energy and effort towards assessing that and measuring that to prove that point. In traditional academic research, you might include things such as, moderators of treatment on outcome, where you're not necessarily needing to prove that in order to get clearance for a particular device in an FDA-based pivotal trial design. Another consideration is length of follow-up study, right? Academics, traditional academic papers may have a longer term follow-up. The FDA is interested in that, but you might find that your payers or reimbursers are more interested in that than your FDA audience. So these are just a couple of things that might differ between how you set up studies in those two worlds. Acacia, what would you add? I'm sure you
Meanwhile, everybody's hair is on fire because they want to get to market yesterday. That's what I would add, right? So I think we come from a very kind of slow, deliberate, let's do this in stages. First, we have to find some green shoots that this is useful, and then we do the next stage. But in practice, at least from my early days being at a more wellness consumer facing and B2B company, it's but a competitor's already in there. So what can we do to get there and have evidence as soon as humanly possible? So on one hand, we have certain stakeholders that may not have the same standards or expectations from FDA, but where we need to put data in front of them as quickly as possible. And so there's this mixed tool bag that you've got to have depending on who your audience is, where you're doing potentially completely different types of studies. I don't think you could squeeze scientific integrity out of either of us, right? But thinking about in terms of trade-offs of internal to external validity, which is how I've always thought about it, where I think the normal progression of things, if we had all the time in the world, is from highest internal validity to highest external validity at the end, when we really feel like we're locked down on the things that we controlled in earlier stages. You might go to a higher external validity study to begin with, because you're trying to answer questions that are about the real world. HEOR is just such a good example of that, where I think it's easy to think, oh, well, that's expensive, we'll do that later. But it's okay, but it takes 2 years to do. So you actually really have to start it now if you want to have it 2 years from now. So there's a lot of also strategic thinking about who you're going to be trying to make claims in the direction of it 2 years from now, which is so hard to do in the startup world. And then what kind of study is going to provide the data for that kind of secondary analysis also. So there's just a lot of I spent a lot of time trying to think about whether there's just a single study that could yield a lot of these things, because it's, from a resource perspective, from a personnel perspective, it's much easier to kind of do a single thing, but it's really, really, really hard.
Yeah, I guess in academia, we always get to write more research is needed, but in this case, you're the ones doing the more research as well. Jason, just a question on that. So if we have this bag of studies, right, we have some that are very regulatory focused and some that are maybe a bit more sort of pragmatic, shall we say. Is the FDA going to read them all when we go and submit our homework? Or do we kind of get to sort of shape what they're going to look at, or they just go swimming and try and find everything that's relevant?
So, the FDA has very limited resources, and so they're going to look at what you present to them, and of course, if you have a smart advisor, the advisor is going to advise you to present only what's necessary and only what supports whatever the legal standard is, substantial equivalence or safe, benefit risk, and so. It really is going to depend on, the point made about whether you're designing a study for, payers versus the FDA, and, if you're designing one study that's going to tackle both FDA and payers, then great. But if you're really going to do multiple studies and one is really focused on the payers, I mean, the FDA is probably not going to really care or need to see that. So it's going to really kind of depend on the studies that you're designing, but certainly to Athena's point about the ARC and kind of, the early feasibility data the FDA wants to see, if you're looking at if you have multiple kind of performance related studies, and particularly if you have, the data there is meant to support the claims that you're making. So if you're claiming that you can, treat patients for 12-month period, but your first study is only 3 months, well, you're going to need a second study, and it's going to have to be for 12 months. And so they're going to want to, the data that you present, the data that the FDA is going to want to see is going to have to cover the full scope of your intended use and all the claims that you're making about the product.
Another question I sometimes get asked is how much of a difference does it make if you're doing something independently versus, with a well-known academic partner? Does that make a major difference? Or is the data, or it's to do with the protocol and the study and the execution, having a logo?
Yeah, I mean, so look, the people that work at the FDA are not automatons. I mean, they're human beings, and they're scientists and clinicians, and they come from the same world that Acacia and Athena come from, who are kind of have, the various influences of the hundreds of years of his scientific history that you mentioned, Paul. And so, they're going to see a Stanford or Harvard or and they're going to like, okay, this is probably a little more, there's a little more credibility there, but it's not a requirement at all, right? You can do all of it in-house under your own, an independent. You can get a private IRB to oversee, and you could do things in a manner that is not necessarily the traditional, purely kind of working with an academic institution to support that. But they're human beings, and they get influenced by those types of things just like anybody else does.
Well, and other stakeholders other than FDA definitely are influenced by those things, right? So like there are lots of reasons to pursue partnerships like that. I will say, having started off this whole thing with an internal research team that ran RCTs, but like the way that I would have just done in an academic lab and not the way I would have done to support any kind of FDA submission. If you are going to run things yourself, there are ways FDA expects you to do research that are different from how you're probably running research today if you haven't been doing FDA research. So for example, we had research coordinators who we had to designate were were on our side versus site coordinators, and they both worked for us, but they couldn't talk to each other about the study. And that requires you to have twice as many coordinators. So there are personnel and kind of division ways that you have to keep things, to certain specific standards that nobody naturally has unless they've been conducting academic research as a site for an FDA clinical trial already, right? Of course, those things are going to be similar, but we at least had to go through the process of like understanding what it means to be a site or to be siteless. And those are all significant undertakings. And I know there was a question about kind of a transition from wellness space and what it takes to be doing regulated product and regulated quality and regulated work in all kinds of different areas. And it's just a big transition. It's a lot of work. That's what I'll just say on that is, I mean, there's I think on multiple fronts, right? So you've got a product you're used to changing anytime you want to, which is no longer the case. You have to do version control, you have to do quality management. It's very different from what I think your average wellness company is used to. So product, the change management process affects a lot of things. The level of documentation needed is just massive. And there'll be things in your company that aren't documented that you could go back and like reconstruct what the documentation would have been so that you are documented on everything. So there's catch up to do. And it's the same with research. It's like, you may have a study that you're using to support claims that you didn't document in a way that is thorough enough, because I was not trained to do that as an academic, right? I had to learn that when we started to make this shift. And research is way more expensive when it's intended for a regulated audience because of all the things I just described, all the extra things that you need to do and worry about to kind of demonstrate impartiality. So it's a significant undertaking, which isn't to say you can't do it. Like we certainly did it at TWIL, but it can take a long time to execute. It can be expensive, and it's definitely a major organizational shift from whatever you're doing today.
And
Totally
an
agree.
educational shift, right? Like we spend all this time teaching people how to teach undergraduate stats or write grants and stuff, which when we come out into this world is not super helpful. So we kind of need to make a boot camp. I did promise we'd get to some questions, and I know some have been coming up, and I know all the panelists can see them as well. So please do jump in if there's one you particularly want to jump on. There were a couple of sort of shorter ones that seemed like, Jason, maybe you could take. When you were talking earlier about those three pathways, I know I would love to know, in a sort of larger than a bread bin, smaller than a Volkswagen kind of way. You said time and resource commitments for each of those three. Is there a rough, like, it's $1 trillion, that's 1,000? What is a rough, like, what's a thing that people could be putting on their PowerPoints to at least be thinking about these challenges and options?
Sure. As any good lawyer, it depends is the only thing that you should be putting on the slide. But in reality, so there are some general rules that you can point to, and in my experience, they're very process driven by the FDA. So if you think about the overall timeline of concept to market from an FDA regulatory perspective, there's a lot of work that you do upfront to get ready to submit to the FDA, and that's going to be very much company and product specific. That could take years, it could take months. I can't comment on that, right? When you get to the point where you submit your pre-market package to the FDA, that's where there's much more predictability. So if you're in the 510K pathway, the way the process is set up is that the FDA has two 90-day review periods, right? So the first 90-day review period, they look at the materials and they essentially come back with what's called an additional information request, or AI letter, not artificial intelligence. And so they're asking you for more information, more documentation, clarity on whatever you submitted. And that you have 180 days as a company to respond to that letter. You can do it in a week, you could do it in 180 days, whatever you want. That's on you. The second 90-day clock in the 510K process begins when you've responded to the AI letter. And at the end of that second 90-day clock, you're going to get either a yes or a no. It's substantially equivalent or it's not. And if it is, hallelujah, you can market your product. So you're talking about 180 days plus however much time it takes you to respond to their questions, right? That's pretty standard. On the de novo side, it's a similar process, but the timeline's a little longer, and it's usually about two 120-day review periods. And same thing, they give you your AI letter, you respond to it, they review, and then they have to make a final decision. And this is all driven by the fact that Congress pays the FDA extra money if they meet certain review timelines that the industry and the FDA have agreed to. It doesn't mean, this is a misnomer. Many people think, oh, it has to be reviewed in X period of time. And the reality is there's a probability distribution, and the mean has to be, or a certain percentage of the overall submissions needs to be within that time frame. So you could have one that's 365 days of review period as opposed to 180. So there are outliers in that process. Cost wise, there are the fees associated paid to the FDA. The 510K is on the order of $5,000. The de novo is on the order of $125,000, which gives you some sense of how much more review materials the FDA has to review in the de novo versus in a 510K submission. And then, of course, whatever it costs for you to prepare those materials prior to submission is going to be somewhat similar in proportionality to the user fees, because you need to rely either on internal or external resources to support you in the preparation of those submissions.
Got it. Okay. So as the market grows, we should expect to see more and more people having the opportunity to claim that there are predicates, for example, and be able to move faster, hopefully, at the expense of those pioneers who are breaking the new ground, of course. So, I know we had a couple of other questions. I know that the team's going to try and see if there are answers they can shoot to those, but I did think there was an interesting one here about, will the FDA accept evidence from trials outside the USA? Right, so sometimes some of the sort of validating studies might have been done in the UK or the Netherlands, or also in Germany sometimes. And I know with drugs, we see different things in like Japan and US and where the trials are conducted. Is there a consistent sort of approach on that?
So the stated rule or policy of the agency is that at least 50% of the data that are presented need to be from within the United States. And to Acacia's point, any data that's collected OUS needs to be, well, all data, but particularly data that's collected OUS needs to be collected in accordance with the good clinical practices that the FDA has established. And in many cases, and the reason why the FDA specifically calls that out is in many cases, the FDA has found that OUS clinical studies are not performed at the level of rigor and with the level of integrity that the FDA expects in order to be able to rely on the results of the studies.
Yeah, and I suppose they want that consistent approach. I feel like I should apologize on behalf of the OUS population as their representative here, but you know, we will try and do better, Jason. We will try and do better. Time has flown by. I would do this for 5 hours if I could, because I would continue learning a lot more, but I know we all have things to get on with and our speakers are extremely busy. So just falls on me to say thank you so much to Athena, to Acacia and Jason for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. Clearly, Jason is available for being that smart person who can advise you. And I would advise anybody interested in this to go off to Google Scholar and look at the works of Acacia and Athena, because the great thing about working with scientists is they publish their work, right? We can see these kind of as they go through, and we can sort of see the work in progress. And so maybe there's some things you can learn from there and kind of adopt. And yeah, we hope that everybody on this call will be accelerating their technologies, because we all believe that the ultimate aim of this is to deliver great care at a massive scale that all the health systems that they really need. So thank you for all the work that you all do in your space, and thanks so much for your time today. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Pleasure.